Welcome to the first video in the Blender for Blogs video editing series. This is a whole series where I will be showing you how to make this video that you're seeing here in the corner of my screen. Of course, this one is without sound here, just as a preview, but to watch the full promo video that I created, click on the link in the description. But in this video, I'm actually going to be showing you the setup that I use for optimal video editing in Blender. Of course, everything is completely optional. It's just what I've found to be the most efficient setup, at least in my opinion. I've also created a video editing cheat sheet showing all of my setup, plus a list of all the shortcuts that I'll be using for video editing. You can get that by going to blenderfrenzy.com on the homepage, and you'll find that over on the right sidebar there. So I do want to mention before I get started, I've created two of these setup videos. This is the beginner version for those who are new to Blender or those who like more detailed explanations. I'll be going a lot slower, showing how the Blender user interface works, and then explain a little bit more detail what I'm doing and why. So if you want to see the more condensed version where I don't talk as much, then I'll leave that link in the description as well. So you can check that out. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go ahead and close that. And when you first open up Blender, this is what it's going to look like here. You see this splash page right in the middle of the screen. And it shows our Blender version 2.79b, which this is the most recent version at the time of this recording. 2.8 is just around the corner, and I know everybody is excited for that. Other than that, we also have some things down here. We've got a couple of links to the Blender website and other things. But then you see this interaction here. And this is for if you're coming from 3ds Max or Maya, this is like the keyboard layout and the shortcuts and stuff. So if you're used to those kind of things from Maya or 3ds Max, you might want to just check those. I'm going to keep it on Blender for now because I'm actually going to be changing individual shortcuts later on, and I'll show you how to do that. And then we have a recent here. So a list of your recent files will be shown here once you start saving. So to get out of this, all you have to do is click anywhere on the screen and that disappears. Now this is the default view when you open up Blender. It is the 3D view, and that's because Blender is primarily a 3D software program used for 3D modeling and animation, creating game characters, things like that. We won't be using this layout, but I want to stay here just for a bit to demonstrate the first thing that I'm going to change, and that's the way that you select. So right now, if I try to just select something, so try to click on this camera, you see this red and white circle up here. Basically, it started at the center of the grid, and you just move it around with your left mouse button. The way you actually select things is with your right mouse button. So if you click the right, I'm selecting them by hitting the right mouse button. You can't select with your left by default. So I'm actually going to change that because I'm more of a left select type of guy. So if you like the right select, you can keep it, but I'm going to go to File and User Preferences. So that I just went File up here, User Preferences. And on the Input tab, I'm going to go down where you see Select With. Right now, right is highlighted. I just want to click left to make that highlighted. You can also emulate your numpad. This is if you don't have a separate 10 key on your keyboard, like a smaller laptop where the only numbers you have is the top number row. It just means that the top number row will emulate the same kind of commands that the numpad would. I suggest that if you don't have that 10 keypad. So I'm going to save user settings now down here and then just close out of this for now. So now if I go back here, I can just select with my left mouse button like regular. Now again, we don't really care about the cursor or any of this stuff in this view, but I just wanted to demonstrate that right off the bat, I like to change that select mode. All right, so let's change our layout now to the video editing layout. So to do that, to go up here, it says choose screen layout. This little icon here, the drop down box, you can click that and you have a list of different layouts. I'm going to go down to the bottom where it says video editing and click that. And here is our video editing layout. Now, before I do anything or explain anything or change anything, the first thing that I'm going to do is make a copy of this. And all you have to do is hit that plus button where it says add a new screen, and basically it's just going to make a copy of the video editing. I'm going to click that, and then now you see video editing .001. If I click this icon again for that drop down, you see now I have 2 of them. So I'm going to rename that just by clicking in here. I'm going to type in 01 just video editing. We're just video editing. Actually, the just is for Justin there. Okay, so let's look at the breakdown of this layout that we see here. We've got the top menu bar right here, area. This area is our graph editor. This area is the image preview window. This area is our image sequencer, and this area down here is our timeline. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 areas. Now they're called areas. They're also called views. They're also called windows. Basically, these are all kind of interchangeable. So if you hear me interchanging them, just bear with me. I'm just referring to the same thing, these areas, and you'll get used to it eventually. Now this top area is actually not just a menu bar, but it is actually an area window all of itself. So if I hover over here till I see the double arrows and click and drag down, you can see that you have an area window here, and all of the windows have this little menu bar at the bottom of them. As you can see here, same thing here, and down here, and down here. All of them have this menu bar. Over here, this little icon will tell you what editor type is being used for that area. And you can see this is the info editor. And basically what this is just every action you take, it'll have a line of Python code up here. And that's for more advanced users. If you want to copy and paste the Python code or see what's going on behind the scenes, you can do that. Now, I don't actually want to do that right now, so I'm just going to pull that back up, and let's take a look at the editors for these other areas. So if we hover over this icon, it says current editor type for this area is the graph editor. Same thing over here. This is the video sequence editor. Down here, this is also the video sequence editor, just a different part, and I'll show you that in a second. And then down here we have the timeline. Now, these menu bars you can see have different options, but if you can see the options are cut off by another area, a really quick way to see more of your options is to click and hold the middle mouse button and then drag. And that way you can scroll that over so you can see the hidden buttons that were cut off from that other area, which is really cool. Now, if you see the whole area, obviously no sliding needs to happen. But if you can't see it, that is a very useful feature there. Now, you can also change the editor type for the area. So if I click on this icon, it'll bring a drop-down list, or in this case, a drop-up list of the different editors that you can choose. So I can make this the node editor if I want, or I could make this the timeline. You can have multiple of the same editors on there. It doesn't matter which editor you'd like. You can do the file browser, which is nice if you want to import things, if you like doing that. Now, when I changed the file browser, you can see that this disappeared down here, this menu bar. Well, it didn't really disappear, it just flipped up to the top. And I don't know why it does that, but a couple of editors do that. So just keep in mind, if you don't see it down here, it's probably up at the top. So I'm going to change that back to our graph editor. And by the way, that can be done with any of these things. Here's a 3D view. Any area can be changed to any editor type. So back to video sequence editor. Now, like I was saying, this is the video sequence editor, as we saw, and this is also the video sequence editor, but they look completely different. Why is that? Well, this is because you have 3 options here. The next icon, if you hover over it, says type of sequencer view is the image preview. And so you can see that that is what is highlighted here. So this is the image preview, and this is just the sequencer by themselves. But if you click over on this last one, it's going to actually combine the two. into one area. Now this is one area, it's not two, but you do have the option to resize the sequencer in the preview. You can adjust that there within that one area, which is really cool. And that's actually what I'm going to eventually be using. And I'll show you that here shortly. But before we start changing the layout, I want to show you one more thing, and that is the use of the in key. The in is in Nancy. So if I hit in, it's going to open up this properties panel. And that is the case for most of the windows. Most of the areas have a properties panel. Timeline doesn't, I don't think, but a lot of them do. So that toggles that on and off, different properties to change, and we'll be using those definitely throughout our video editing. Now you can also see, you see this little plus button, it does the same thing, that pulls that out. To collapse it, you can actually resize this however big you want, and then to collapse it, you can also just go all the way in, and then you see that little plus again, same thing with this plus here. All right, so that's a little bit about the areas and the windows and kind of the layout and what you see here initially. But I'm actually not going to use this layout as it is, which is why I made a copy. I want to create my own, so I'm going to start collapsing these windows into each other. And in order to do that, there are these little ridges on the bottom left corner and the top right corner. And if you hover over those ridges, you see this plus button. And then if you click and then drag, you can see a little arrow coming up. If I hover over this window without letting go, I can see that arrow. And then if I let go, then it collapsed the left area into the right area. So now this is all one big area, and that area is gone. So now we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 areas. And I can do the same thing with the bottom into the top. So I'm going to take that, click and drag up, and you can see that arrow. Now, if I let go, it's going to collapse the bottom into the top. But let's say I change my mind and I want to collapse the top into the bottom. I can just move the mouse cursor down and hover over the bottom, and this way it's going to collapse the top into the bottom. So I can do up or down. And in this case, I want to do up, so I'm going to hover over the top and let go, and now I've collapsed the bottom into the top. Now I only have 1, 2, 3 areas. You can also use these ridges to drag out new areas. So if I hover over that, click, and then drag and pull out, I've now just created a duplicate window of the area that I pulled from. Now I want to point out that you can only collapse areas into other areas that have the same size border. So you see this line here. These two areas are the same size as each other. So I can then collapse. But let's say I drag this out and I want to collapse the timeline up. I'm not going to be able to do that because the timeline stretches all the way across the bottom, and you see obviously these don't. So there's a break here. In order for me to collapse this down into this or vice versa, I first have to create a new one here. So drag one out here and line it up with that. And now all these borders are lined up and they match. So now if I take the bottom here and I drag up to collapse this in the top, I can do that because the borders match. Now I don't want to do this actually. So in order to cancel an action, see I haven't let go of my left mouse button yet. If I hit my right mouse button, it's going to cancel. And that's going to be the same for anything that you do in Blender pretty much, is that if you start an action, but you decide that you don't want to do the action before you complete it, then you can just hit that right mouse button and it'll cancel. So I instead want to just drag, there we go. Drag this one into this one to bring my timeline back all the way across the bottom there. Okay, so the next things we're going to change are the user preferences. So I'm going to come down here, click this icon, and change this to the user preferences. Now we're just going to go straight across the tabs here, changing different things. So we're going to start with the interface tab. I'm going to come down here and check global scene. And what that does is going to lock this scene so that when I change through my different layouts, this scene stays there. It locks it there. Now, if I click here, you can see you can have multiple different scenes. If you don't check global scene, then if you change your layout, you could potentially be changing your scene as well, because the layouts are associated with different scenes, which can be really confusing because scenes have entirely different properties. They can have entirely different, video and audio strips, depending on how you set it up, used for different purposes. So if I'm changing between my layouts, I might not even be aware that the scene is changing. So if I click global scene, I don't have to worry about that. Then whatever scene I see here is going to stay there no matter what layout I choose. So we're going to keep that there. The next tab is the editing tab, and we're not going to change anything here, but I want to show you where the undo steps are. So you can actually change the undo steps. You can make them bigger or smaller. If you click and drag on these little sliders here, you can see that it's changing. Again, in the middle of an action like this, see, I haven't let go of my left mouse button. If I hit my right mouse button, it's going to cancel that. So let's say I start to change this and I'm like, oh, that's the wrong slider. I don't want to change this. Right mouse button, it will cancel it back to the default. So I'm going to keep that actually at 32 and go over to the input tab. So the input tab should look a little familiar because this is what we started with when we did our selection mode, when we changed from right to left. So this is the same place here. And then here's that emulate numpad there as well. But over here on the right, you can see a list of all these different things. Now, this is where Blender's shortcut list is. And up here, remember our splash screen showed us Maya and 3ds Max. You can actually change that here too, where you have your Maya or 3ds Max keyboard layout. But I'm going to keep this on Blender because I want to actually change individual keyboard shortcuts. And the first one I'm going to start with is the way you play and pause things. So I'm going to go to the search bar, type play. And down here where it says frames, you can see it says play animation. And then you see keyboard. And then right next to that, you see Alt-A. And this is your keyboard shortcut. So if I hover over here in the sequencer and I hit Alt-A, you can see I can play and pause that cursor. Now, the Alt-A combination is really awkward and it's 2 buttons, and so it's just too slow. I need something faster, so this is not going to do. So I want to change it to the space bar. But currently, if I press the space bar, it comes up with this search bar, which is really handy if you're searching for things, but I don't want it to be the space bar. So I'm going to change this. And the way you do that is coming over to where it says Alt-A, it says type of event, and I'm going to click that, and now it says press a key. I'm just going to press the space bar. And now if I hover over here again with my cursor and then I hit space bar, then you can see the space bar now plays and pauses my timeline and my sequencer. Now you see it also added a restore button here. So if I click that, it's going to restore it back to the default. Also, see these little X's here, don't click those because then that will delete that keyboard shortcut. But if I change this back to a spacebar, you can see that X changed into an arrow, and basically it does the same thing as the restore button. If I click that, it goes back to the default. So, spacebar. Now, I still want to be able to search, so I want to change the search function. So I'm going to type in search, search menu, click that, and press the dash key right next to the 0 key on the top number row. And now if I hit that dash key, it's going to come up with that search bar. Okay, so the next one I want to change is the way we unhide strips. And it's actually not called hide and unhide, it's called mute, which is really weird because the shortcut for mute is H, which is more like hide, which I can remember, hide, but it's called mute. So if you look for hide here, you're not going to find it. But I'm not going to change that one because that one's just fine. I'm going to change the way you unhide things. So currently Alt-H is unhide, and again, that's a bit of an awkward combination. So I'm just going to change that by clicking there and hitting H. Now I wish this actually just toggled back and forth. So hide and unhide, just hit H over and over again. Now, if you do know or find out a way that I can do that to make it toggle, please let me know because I don't know how to do that. But the workaround that I found is if I do the drop down again with our options, over here where it says press, if I click that and then go double click, and then it says double H. So now hide is H and double H is unhide. And I found that works really well and it's really fast. Okay, so there's one more thing that I want to change for the keyboard shortcuts, and that is if I come over to the sequencer and I click select, you can see all strips to the right and all strips to the left. So you want to select all to the right or all to the left. Currently, there is no keyboard shortcut that is assigned to those commands. So you actually have to access it through the menu. And you can see up here, the ones up here you can see do have the keyboard shortcuts. So that means we're going to have to add these keyboard shortcuts. So the way you do that, and this is a little bit advanced, but it's not too difficult. The way you do that is you click this X here to go back to where you have your full list, and then find sequencer and open that. Open the sequencer global, and then scroll all the way down to where you see add new. And this is where we're going to add our new map item, key map item. So click that and then open the drop down box, and where it says none, just click in there and then type sequencer dot select, enter. And once you hit enter, you have a little bit more options over here. But before I get to those options, click there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press and hold shift and then hit the right bracket. And then down here where it says left and right, it's grayed out, but you can still actually choose something here. So I'm going to choose right. So shift right bracket is going to select all of the things to the right, all the strips to the right. I'm also going to select linked time. And now if I go back over here to my select, you can see, voila, we have now added shift right bracket to selecting all strips to the right as a shortcut. So we want to add one for the left as well. So let's do add new and open this up and copy and paste this in here. Select this. We want to do shift left bracket now and select left linked time. Now we can see we have both of our shortcuts for selecting all strips to the right and to the left, which is going to make that very handy for us. And before I forget, let's save our user settings down here. Save, because we've changed a lot so far. And that is it, I think, for the input tab. So moving along, we are going to go to the add-ons tab. And you can either come down here and click node, or you can type in the search node. And then we want to check the Node Wrangler add-on. And that's all we have to do there. Now themes, I'm not going to change my theme, but I want to point out that you can change the look of your Blender user interface. So the easiest way to do that is go to presets and then select something. So it completely changes the look and the feel. It doesn't change any of the functions, just changes the theme or the look of it. Back to black, different things that you might like. We got Science Lab. The graph, this has a little bit of an Adobe Premiere feel, I thought. So if you kind of like that look, you can select that. Now you can also change, you can make your new ones. So if you click plus, then you can name it. I'm just name it Justin. Okay. And now I've made a copy basically of graph, but it's called Justin, and it's right there. Look at that. And you can change specific things. So like the radio buttons, you can change to different colors. And as you change it, you can see those radio buttons that are selected are actually being affected by the color that I'm choosing. Before I make my selection, I'm going to right click and cancel that. I'm actually just going to reset mine to the default theme because that's just fine for me. And next tab is File. Now, I'm not going to really change anything here. We're not really going to be using the fonts because that's going to be more for like 3D if we want to do 3D motion graphics or something. That's where that will go. You put your fonts directory, which Windows I think is C Windows Fonts. And then if you wanted to change where your temporary Blender files go, like auto saves and things like that, you can choose a manual folder for that, which is what I normally do. I keep everything about the same otherwise here on this tab. And the last tab here is the System tab. Now, there are two things I want to point out here. The first one is the Cycles Compute device. Mine says none because I do not have a separate GPU. I only have the CPU for rendering, but if you do have a GPU that you can render from, it will show up here, and I would suggest that you select that because that's going to help speed up your render times. And the other thing that I change on here is the sequencer clip editor memory cache limit. Now, my computer has 8 gigabytes of RAM, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in here, and then I'm going to click again, and then I'm going to do ×2. And then you can do this in any of these little option slider things. You can do math, you can do +2, you can do ×2. It's really cool. So I'm just going to do ×2. This is good for me for the memory cache limit. You can make this higher if you want, but just realize that the closer to the maximum RAM that you have, the slower your system is going to be when it's rendering. Now, it's going to give it a lot of render power, but you're not going to be able to do anything else on your computer because it's going to use all of your system resources just for that rendering or editing or whatever it is that you're doing. So I like to keep mine around 2 gigabytes. All right, and then again, I'm going to save my user settings so that I don't forget and change this to the Properties panel, because we were done with the user preferences. And now we're going to change the properties. So the properties panel is going to be our dimensions and our output and everything that we're going to use to kind of get our video ready to be rendered, whether it's testing or a final render. And you can see this scroll bar here to scroll up and down. You can also use your mouse wheel to scroll up and down. And to open and close these categories, you can just click the name there, and that'll open and close them. But a cool thing that I found out recently, which is just, I think, really convenient and amazing, is if I start to close this, but I hold it and then I drag my mouse down, everything that it hovers over, it's going to close automatically. So that's super useful. Just one swoop and I can close all of those at the same time. It's the same thing for opening them. If I click and hold and then drag up, it's going to open all of them. I just thought that was the greatest thing. It was so awesome. So I'm going to close all of those again, and I'm going to rearrange the order here a little bit. You can do that by going over here to the handlebar. I'm going to choose post-processing. I'm going to click this handlebar and then drag up. And then I'm going to drag my output up right under dimensions. And basically we're only going to be using these 4 and then a 5th one once we change our output, and that'll pop up automatically. But this is the order that I like to have it in. So let's start looking at these options. So post-processing, the reason I have it first, I know it's kind of confusing because post is like after. But remember when I said Blender is primarily a 3D software program? So the 3D software rendering comes first. In Blender's eyes. So that's the very first thing that it renders. Anything else it renders, like the sequencer or the compositor, that's going to be post-processing. It's after the 3D render. But since we're not using the 3D render, it's actually going to be our first thing that we're going to do. So if I open this, you can see compositing and sequencer. I'm going to uncheck compositing for now because we're just going to be using the sequencer. Now we will be going back and forth depending on the jobs that we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to close that. Now render, I'm not going to do anything here now except for maybe change the display, but I just want to point out that the render button renders one frame. So whatever frame you're on, it'll make one image of that frame if you click render. If you hit animation, Animation's going to render all of the frames that you have set in range, and you can define the range. Right now, our range here, if you look down at the timeline, is frame 1 to frame 250. So that is our frame range. So if you click animation, it's going to render from frames 1 to frames 250. Now audio, you can, whatever audio you have in your frame range, it's going to mix down. So if you have several different audio files, it's going to mix it down all into one audio file when you click that. So those are the different types of renders. The image editor here, I'm actually going to click this and do Keep UI, and I'll show you why and that matters in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to close that, and next one, dimensions. Now you can choose your preset for different platforms that you want to render it out to. You can take a look at those. I don't actually use that. Most of my videos are 1920 by 1080, so I'm just going to keep that for my resolution. And then here I'm going to change this to 100%. Now I do want to point out that you can use this slider, but this is one of Blender's little bugs and crashes that I've found every time I have a big video and I try to slide this and change it, it doesn't work. So I found what works better is if I just type the number that I want here, and then I don't have any problems. I'm going to start with 100% just so I don't forget that it's at 50. I'm going to leave everything else the same. The frame rate is going to change based on the first video that I import. So whatever the first video that I import, whatever frames per second that is, that's what this is going to be. You can also manually change it by selecting it here. Okay, collapse that, go to output. And the first thing I want to change is my directory. I'm actually going to just click in there and then type // and then type renders and then enter. And that's where most of my renders are going to go. The / is just going to be the directory where my blend files are saved. I'm going to uncheck overwrite for now. And then make sure it says PNG and then RGBA. Now this is really important. The RGBA, the A is for alpha, which is for your transparency. So if we're doing any sort of green screen removal and we want to overlay that on top of other things, we need to make sure we have that transparency. RGB will just make either a black or a white background, and we won't be able to overlay that on anything. So make sure that's RGBA. Compression and color depth is just fine. The next thing that I want to change is the video. So this is our PNG options. If I click this and then I go to FFmpeg video and here click RGB. Now you can see that overwrite has now been grayed out. And I just want to point that out is that it doesn't matter if you check this or not. So even if that's checked, it's still going to overwrite video. It will always overwrite video, so be very careful if you've created a whole video and then you want to go create another test video, make sure you rename your file before you do it because it will overwrite that. Just wanted to make you aware of that. I will also point that out when we go to render our videos. So the FFmpeg video created this new category here called encoding. I'm going to open this up. And then the first thing I want to do is select presets, H.264 and MP4. Now you can select anything you want here and play around with but these are the settings that I like. So the container changes to MPEG-4, the codec is H.264, and I'm going to change the output quality from medium quality to perceptually lossless, and then encoding speed from medium speed to ultra fast and biggest file. The next thing I'm going to change is the keyframe interval is currently at 18. Now, if I go back up to my dimensions, I have heard that the keyframe interval should be half of your frames per second. So since mine is 24, I'm going to do 12. My videos are actually 23.98 frames per second, but it's still pretty much the same. So half of that is 12. I'm going to scroll down where it says audio codec. I'm going to click none, and then select MP3, and then I'm going to keep the bitrate at 192. So that is it for the properties panel. I think I've got everything set up that I need to, and I'm going to resize by hovering over here where you see the double arrows and then clicking and dragging. And one thing I want to point out is when you're resizing these windows, just so you're aware that if you resize it too small, you will start to lose letters. And you won't actually get any indication sometimes that there are more letters. So it depends on how far out. So here, like aspect RA and then ... meaning there are more letters after this, and same down here. But sometimes you don't actually have that. Sometimes they disappear completely, and then you have aspect RA. And if you're not aware that this is happening, you might not understand, what things are being displayed here. So for example, here we've got time remap. Okay, we know that might say more things here, but then we have 1 to 10. Well, that's not really actually the values 1 to 10. If we go back and put this out, is actually old 100 and new 100. So that's a lot of information that we're losing. Just be mindful that if something doesn't look right, maybe try to adjust the size of the area so that maybe you can see a little bit more. And I'm going to resize it to about there, I think is good. And for the sequencer, remember how we have different views? I'm going to come over here and change this to both the sequencer and the preview window. And remember, this is the properties panel, and that's within this area. All three of these here, this panel, the image preview, and the sequencer are all one area, even though they look like three different. And you can toggle this by pressing in. Now, I also want to point out that this is the properties panel, and depending on the area you are in, you can have different properties panels. But this is the properties editor or the properties area. So these two are completely different things. This is where we're going to be rendering out a lot of our video and all of our settings. This properties panel is only changes the properties for this area, this editor here. So it does take a little bit of getting used to, especially the terminology and all of that stuff, but you'll get there eventually. Okay, a few more things that I want to change. I'm going to go down here where it says no sync, click that, click AV sync for audio video synchronization. And this is just so that I can scrub through the timeline. And by the way, this scrub here, it's my right mouse button. If you change the select mode to left mouse select, then it's the right mouse button is going to drag that cursor. If you did not change that and you still have right select, then your left mouse button is going to drag that cursor. But for now, I'm going to click this button down here where it says jump to the beginning. So we want to start at frame 1. And that is it for this layout. I'm just going to hide that for now by pressing in, like Nancy, the in key. And before I lose everything, I'm going to save it. So I'm going to do Control S for save. Go to my Blender folder. I'm going to type this video underscore editing underscore default underscore 01. Enter, enter. All right, now I have this saved. Okay, so I want to add 2 more custom layouts. So I'm going to go up here, click the drop down, go to compositing, make a copy, and I'm going to rename this to O2 Just Compositing. And this is where we're going to be removing our green screen and maybe a little color correction and stuff like that. So I'm going to change just a couple things here. I want to swap these 2 windows. So in order to do that, hover over this ridge, hit Control, click and drag over into this window with the mouse button. You see that little icon there. Let go. They have just swapped. Now you can do this with any area. So if I hover over this, Control, click and drag into this area, those 2 areas swap. So hover, Control, click and drag. For this area, I actually want to change this to the video sequence editor and then select the middle button here where it says image preview. Click that. And that's just going to show us our image preview from our sequence editor. This window can stay the same. The next thing I want to do is make sure that this timeline goes all the way across the bottom. And we can't just click and drag now because remember, we have to have the borders be the same size. And so the border ends here with our timeline. So in order to fix that, I'm just going to click and drag another one of these up and line that up there. And same with this one, click and drag here. Now, I'm just going to demonstrate. Sometimes when you're clicking and dragging these out, they don't actually automatically line up for some reason. If that happens, just let go, and then you might have to adjust both of these here a little bit, like say here, and then maybe here, and then they'll line up eventually. So just in case that happens. And the way you know that they're all matching is that if you move one of them, then they all move. So that's how you know. And now we can drag this into this area and this into this area. And now our timeline goes all the way across the bottom, just like we want it to. Now, the properties panel over here is not set up the same. Remember, we reordered some of these things here. So post-processing on the top. I'm going to do the same thing here because for some reason in different layouts, it doesn't match, and I don't know why, but post-processing, I'm going to move back up to the top, output under dimensions, and encoding under output, just like that. That'll be just fine for now. And now I'm going to add one more custom layout from the UV editing layout. So I'm going to make a copy, 03, and I'm going to call this rendering. And this is what we're going to use for our render preview. So I'm going to collapse this window into this area, or this area into this area. Then I'm going to click and drag and pull up a timeline. So I'm going to change this to timeline. And then if I hover over here and hit the N key, N for Nancy, then I'll close that properties panel. And then I'm going to drag out a properties editor. So drag out a new area, change this to properties. And again, we're going to have to reorganize this here. So post-processing on the top, output under dimensions, and encoding under output, just like that. Perfect. All right, last thing, under render, we have display as image editor. Now, what that means is the image editor is going to show up in any of the windows here that were last active. So if I come over here and I click render, it's going to preview that render process in whichever window was the last active. You could also do, I mean, it's up to you. You can do the image editor. If you do new window, a new window pops up. But the reason I don't like that is because it doesn't have a timeline. And so that's why I created this timeline down here. And you can also do full screen, whatever. I'm going to click keep UI. And basically what that's going to do is nothing. So if I'm on my video editing layout, you're not going to see anything rendering. You'll see, I think up here, you'll see a progress bar, but that's about it. So I want to actually use the rendering here for our preview, and then we can see the status of it. We can see how far along it is by looking at the timeline, and then we can see our preview right here. So I thought that's just the best way to go about doing that. Again, it's all personal preference. But having done all of that, I think we are ready. So these are the 3 layouts that we're going to be using for optimal video editing. So what I want to do is save this again, so Control S, but if I move my mouse away, I haven't saved it. So Control S doesn't just save it automatically. And you can tell by the little star here right after Blender. That means Blender has been changed since the last time we saved it. So the reason is because if I hit Control S, it gives me this dialog box asking me if I want to save over. So I do, but if I just move my mouse away, I haven't done that. I have to actually click that. So Control S and then click to save that. And now you can see that star has disappeared, which means we have successfully saved our video editing default layout. Woohoo! All right, so let's get to it. Let's get to some good optimal video editing. See you in the next video.